Okay, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Good afternoon. This is the Political Correctness in Liberal Societies panel, although we may rename it over the course of the discussion today. My name is Nicholas Bruckman. I'm a documentary filmmaker who's done work about freedom of expression as part of the Cinema for Peace program, and I'm very excited to welcome an extremely distinguished panel, two of whom wrote the book on the subject. So we'll begin with quick introductions, and then Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you to give some opening remarks once I've done the brief introductions. So first, I'd like to introduce everybody to Nadine Strossen, who is the former president of the ACLU and the author of Hate, Why We Should Fight It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Matt Forde, on my left, is a political satirist and the host of the Political Party podcast, and he brings a unique role on the perspective of humor and satire in political discourse, and he is currently on his tour, The End of an Era.
The End of an Era tour. Touring the UK, if any of you want to come across. Yeah. You can buy tickets at mattford.com.
Okay. Great, quick plug. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Turley, who's a renowned legal scholar and commentator specializing in constitutional law and freedom of speech, and the author of the recent book, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. And Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us about free speech in the age of rage to begin our panel.
Well, thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be with you and with my friend Nadine, who is one of our country's greatest civil libertarians and is a model for all of my students. And I will spare you my comedic stylings. I was going to do that, and then they brought in a professional, so I'm just not going to do it. But you know, the book itself is actually an effort to try to understand why we're still struggling with free speech after a couple of centuries in the United States. It's called The Indispensable Right because it comes from an opinion by Louis Brandeis, one of the great American civil libertarians, who wrote a beautiful opinion talking about how free speech is indispensable because it's the right that is required to use all the other rights in the Bill of Rights. The reason I used it for the title is because he wrote those wonderful words in an opinion that upheld the conviction of a woman to be sent to jail for protesting lynchings. And she was a communist, a very brave and courageous person named Whitney, Charlotte Anita Whitney. And she was told that she would be arrested if she spoke again about lynching. To drive that point home, they put a police officer directly behind her, and she had the courage to give exactly that speech. And so it went before the Supreme Court with two of our greatest civil libertarians, Brandeis and Holmes, and they signed off. And the question that I raised in the book is, we all seem to say free speech is indispensable, but we can't agree on why. And historically, we have made trade-offs. And what I suggest in the book is that we lost our way, at least in the United States, after a moment of true clarity at the beginning of our revolution. The most revolutionary moment of the American Revolution was what we said about free speech. It was the greatest break from Britain. Britain has never been particularly good at protecting free speech. It still isn't. But the framers identified free speech as a human right, a natural right. And we lost that moment of clarity, and we adopted what I call a functionalist approach. And you've probably heard it before, but it's particularly prevalent in Europe, which is that we protect free speech because of the function that it has for democracy. And it certainly does that. It helps democracy to have free speech. But if that's the reason you are protecting it, it allows for a series of trade-offs because some speech is viewed as not positive for democracy and some is viewed as positive. Some speech is considered information and some disinformation. And down that slippery slope, many countries in Europe have gone. And it is really, and I'll wrap up with this, that I'm glad that we're having this conference in Germany. Germany has struggled with this issue. It has one of the most robust systems of speech regulation and criminalization in Europe. It originally justified that to stop the rise or return of Nazis to power, which I understand, but as it is often the case, it then metastasized into a broader array of criminalization, including comedians. And yet the neo-Nazi movement is flourishing in Germany. What is not flourishing is free speech. A censorship system has not worked once in history. It has a perfect failure rate, and Germany shows it. A recent poll showed that only 17% of Germans said they felt comfortable sharing their views in public. So you've silenced the wrong people. Why don't I end there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. And I'll pick up from there with a question for all panelists, and then we'll go for some questions for each of you individually. And this is certainly a good moment to be having this conversation. We know that things are very fraught. I'll give an example from the documentary community, which is that the recent Oscar-winning film No Other Land, the theater that is showing it in Miami is threatening to have its license revoked for showing the film by the mayor of Miami. So there's a big uproar. It's a news story from a couple days ago. And the documentary specific, my small niche of the world, and of course this is playing out in many other instances. Maybe we'll talk about Mahmoud Khalil and the protest happening right outside here later. But to begin, it's clear that all of the panelists are ardent, fervent supporters of free speech and free speech rights. But of course, outside in the other rooms in this conference, there are chats going on about hate speech, about misinformation, other things that may be considered, perhaps not by you guys, as areas where we should limit or compromise. So is there, for any of you, a but when we say free speech but? What is that but? What is that compromise? And I think from there we can work through the other issues.
I wouldn't see it as a compromise at all, Nick, but I see it as the logical limit to freedom of speech. And that's not just a rhetorical distinction, because I want to avoid the cost-benefit, slippery slope danger that Jonathan pointed to. I will use First Amendment law as an example, but I really want to stress that it does reflect universal principles which are also enshrined in important United Nations instruments. And I know those instruments include some language that sounds very censorial by American standards, but I just want to lay on the table that expert UN bodies and officials, including the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, have called for interpreting that UN language very speech protectively. It's an evolution that we went through in the United States. As Jonathan alluded to, for most of the history of the First Amendment, it was essentially a dead letter. We were imprisoning not only the Anita Whitneys of the world, but the Martin Luther Kings of the world, and we did it when we interpreted the speech protective language as including a lot of exceptions. So basically what Brandeis and Holmes laid out in Minority Opinions at the beginning of the 20th century were finally adopted as the majority interpretation in the second half of the 20th century. No coincidence in the context of the civil rights movement, because as is always the case for all individuals or groups that are seeking to protest the status quo, to bring about reform, to bring about social justice and human rights, free speech is their most important tool, and censorship is the most important strategy used against them. So in the context when the Supreme Court, and if you look at the most important landmarks of First Amendment jurisprudence, almost all of them affect civil rights demonstrators, civil rights advocates, newspapers, national media that are covering the civil rights movement. And basically, those opinions adopted the basic concept that Brandeis and Holmes laid out, which is often, I'm going to oversimplify a bit, but I think it really captures the idea. It's often referred to as the emergency principle. And before I even say what that is, the Supreme Court has said that the bedrock principle of free speech is viewpoint neutrality, that government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the content, the message, the idea, no matter how offensive it is, no matter how unpopular it is, no matter how hateful or hated it is, dislike of the viewpoint or some vague fear that it might contribute ultimately to some potential future harm. That's never a justification to suppress it. But if you get beyond the content of the speech and you look at it in its overall context, if it is uttered in facts and circumstances where it either directly causes certain specific harm, such as a targeted threat or targeted harassment of a specific individual, or it imminently threatens to cause some specific serious harm, intentional incitement of imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently, then and only then may it be suppressed. And that's the biggest difference, I would say, between what United States law is now and what some people in many other countries advocate supporting that kind of speech protective standard, not because of devaluing equality and dignity and safety and all the other concerns that are said to be undermined by robust free speech, but precisely for recognizing that if you're going to change people's hearts and minds, you're not going to do it by criminalizing. You're not even going to do it by shaming and shunning and canceling them.
Right. Thank you, Nadine. And same question for you, Matt. Are there, as a comedian, a practitioner on your podcast and the show, are any jokes off limits?
I think a lot
Besides
of it,
not funny ones.
well, of course, not funny ones are not allowed. Although if you read some of my reviews, I've been guilty of them in the past. I think what you do need, well, I think comedy is one thing, is that you have to allow people to cross the line, and you have to allow people to say things that we don't like. Incitement to hatred and violence is obviously something else, and in Britain we don't have exactly the same sort of free speech they have in America. We do have hate crime law, and there's a reason why we have that. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of them. I think I always had an issue with religious views taking precedence over any other opinion. As an atheist, I don't understand why a Christian's opinions are more legally protected than mine as someone who doesn't believe in those things. So there are issues with Britain. I think that comes from the fact that we don't have a constitution that started with first principles in the same way that you did in the United States. Ours is a mess. It's just we just sort of compromise as we go. And I think that's kind of like an expression of the British character in a way. But when you've got a circumstance where I think most people do believe in free speech, what you do need is, you need some sort of, not arbiter of truth, and it can't be the government, but one of the things we have in the UK is the BBC, and the BBC has played an important role in fact-checking political and news stories. And I always think it's very easy to, I'm in my early 40s, I've worked in politics, I like to think I'm discerning about what is real and what isn't. I don't think at any point you can rule out that any of us would fall for a deep fake or something. But what you do need is, certainly for younger people using social media, someone that says, actually, what Andrew Tate says is factually incorrect. What Elon Musk says is factually incorrect. This is not just two opinions. The truth is real on some of these things, and it could be about how much money is spent on certain things, whether people went to prison for the things that Elon Musk claims that they went to prison for. So I think it can't just be the Wild West. On the one hand, you need to let people express themselves clumsily, inappropriately, offensively. We need to be comfortable living in a world where we do periodically get offended, and we effectively have to just accept that we're upset for a little while. But you do also need, if you're going to effectively have that lawless frontier, something that is trusted, that can fact check, that both sides can have a level of faith in.
Great, thank you, Matt. And the fact-checking, I think, brings us kind of to our next large thematic conversation, which is about the role of platforms and the role of social media companies versus governments in providing fact-checking, content moderation, et cetera. Professor Turley, I know you've worked very closely on this issue from, I think, over many decades, including your experience directly with Meta and their policies that we were talking about earlier. So what, if any, role, we've seen the big change in Meta over the last 6 months, changing to a community notes policy in the footsteps of X. What is your take on that change, and what do you believe should be the role, if any, of platforms in moderating content in the way that Matt was talking about in fact-checking?
Well, I think that where I disagree with Matt a bit is I'm not a fan of the British laws, including the hate speech laws. Of course, we have one of the great books on hate speech by Nadine. But On social media, I have to say I was skeptical when I was contacted by Meta, told about their plans to change. I'd been a critic of Mark Zuckerberg for many years, and like many in the free speech community, I was basically, as they say in Missouri, part of the show me state, that it will take a lot to build that trust. But I do think that it's real, that Meta is making real changes in line, as they've said, with what happened to Twitter. In my book, I say, regardless of what you think about Elon Musk in many respects, he changed the course of the free speech fight going on. We were on the ropes. In Europe, free speech isn't a free fall. You look at Germany, France, you look at the United Kingdom, it is just a chilling situation, and free speech groups really were on the ropes. That tide hit the United States. We have our own homegrown anti-free speech movement. We've never seen a movement like this, as I talk about in my book. We've never had an alliance between corporations, government, the media, academia, in support of this movement. Elon Musk changed it. I testified repeatedly in Congress about the censorship system, and then I testified after the Twitter files were released. And I can tell you, it was an amazing difference. That in all of the hearings before that happened, members would say, you've no proof that the United States government is involved in directing censorship or supporting censorship. And I would object, and I'd say, we do have proof. We don't have a lot of it, I admit, because these companies aren't giving us their files, but there is every indication that they are. Well, the Twitter files destroyed that narrative, that suddenly there were just hundreds of emails establishing that agencies were directing, targeting, and funding these efforts to censor people on social media. I wrote a column about when Meta made its change that used this analogy, and I think it's true, that Musk joining the free speech fight was a lot like England joining World War II. It slowed the progress dramatically when England went in. But I told in that column of the free speech community, we need Zuckerberg. That's sort of like when the United States entered World War II. There's a difference in magnitude. The size of Meta and Facebook is so large. It could make the difference. But I do think that we're beginning to see a trend. And I'll just say this to put a button on it. Social media is now more popular than telephones as a form of communication. And the anti-free speech community knew that. They had a virtual lock on social media until Musk bought X. And I've said this before, that I come from a liberal background, worked for Ted Kennedy, come from a Democratic, liberal family, politically active family in Chicago. And I've said, the left makes its own monsters. They went to the minute Musk said he wanted to get rid of censorship, they went to destroy him. And it was the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. And Musk said no. And they've now done that with Zuckerberg. They have turned on Zuckerberg. And quite frankly, I'm glad. They're pushing Zuckerberg again in the same way they did Musk. And so I think we do have progress going on in social media.
If I can say something, just to put on my con law professor hat, private media companies have no obligation to respect First Amendment rights. The First Amendment is only a limit on the government, and I fully agree with recent Supreme Court decisions that struck down government laws that were trying to limit the content moderation policies of social media platforms. Even if I liked the kinds of reforms that were being imposed by the law, I agree with the Supreme Court that the First Amendment protects the editorial discretion of these platforms to decide what messages they will air and which they will not air. So I oppose regulation as a way of affecting their so-called censorship or content moderation policies. But what Jonathan is talking about is the government secretly exerting pressure on the social media companies so that what seemed like their own content moderation slash editorial policies were actually being manipulated behind the scenes by the government, which is, you call it, I think, censorship by proxy. And that it does raise serious First Amendment problems. And as I feel with hate and hate speech, that we don't have to choose between free speech and combating hatred, because free speech is ultimately the most effective way to do that. I think the same is true for disinformation and misinformation. And this week is a very poignant reminder. The 5th anniversary of the COVID lockdowns and the debates about, what caused it and what are effective remedies in response to it. At least in the American media, we're getting a ton of coverage about the suppression that was done by the social media companies, but under pressure from the government to suppress information and hypotheses and analyses about the lab leak theory. Even the New York Times, which I think has, not been good in general on free speech issues, is complaining that its science reporters were now deliberately subject to manipulation, being denied access to certain information and fed certain other misinformation. But that was being portrayed as the gospel truth. And serious scientists who were even questioning the accepted dogma were pilloried as conspiracy theorists. And so there you have the double whammy, the suppression of free speech and the suppression of scientific exploration that is essential for preserving our health and our lives.
Can I ask you one follow-up question about that, which is regarding your point that the platforms don't have this obligation necessarily the way a government might to enforce free speech. What do you make of criticism that they, without government influence, might manipulate algorithms so only a certain kind of speech is promoted? And is that something, I assume, you don't think there should be regulation for, but what are the limits in which that's acceptable?
There is certain, what I would call viewpoint neutral regulation. I'm sorry, one of our panelists who, for various reasons, couldn't actually join us is Jillian York from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF, which does terrific work on this issue, and I'm a longtime member and supporter. So for many years, the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the whole digital rights community has been advocating for privacy protecting legislation and kind of, which I know you have in Europe, but we don't in the United States, and due process type and transparency type requirements that would require all of these companies to, first of all, not engage in the kind of surveillance capitalist model without notice and informed consent, and would have to afford due process if you are deplatformed or shadow banned, that you would have to be given notice and an opportunity, an appeals process. So kind of procedural type protections would go a long way toward minimizing those problems, but without dictating to the platforms what they must say and what they must not say.
Right. Thank you. And back to comedy.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more about the platforms first?
Yeah.
before
Just tell us some jokes.
There may be a Trump impression
Yeah,
in the panel, we'll see.
I don't feel like Elon Musk is an ally of free speech at all. I think he is, he absolutely disproportionately games pro-Putin propaganda, violent stuff. I mean, you only need to, I've been on Twitter almost since day one. It is completely different now. It's more violent, it's more right-wing. The stuff that he comes out, he's completely ignorant about British politics and pontificates on it regularly. You cannot, he's effectively, what they've done is incentivise far more far-right, violent, bigoted stuff. That platform does not operate equally. That is not a balanced platform. If you are aggressive and far-right on there, you'll get more clicks, more likes. Your videos now, there's the new function where before, if you watched a video on X, the video would end and that would be it. Now they've got this sort of scrolling Insta-reel function, and it is nearly always something violent. It's nearly always something on the far right. That is not someone who's comfortable hearing all opinions. Elon Musk only wants to promote and only wants to listen to opinions that reinforce his worldview, and they also happen to be the opinions that Vladimir Putin has. And this isn't just about freedom of speech in America. This is about how major influencers based in America who are global are in hock to the Kremlin. And I think there's going to be a huge price to pay for the sheer amount of sexual violence you see on there, filth of any sort. I don't feel comfortable with what's happened to that platform. And I don't think we just simply shrug our shoulders and say, well, you know, Elon Musk's an ally of free speech. I don't think he is an ally at all.
What do we do, if anything?
Well, I think a lot of the stuff that is on there is criminal. And actually, you saw over the summer in England, we had, last summer there were riots in places like Sunderland in the northeast of England where people basically incited violence against asylum seekers and immigrants, and people were being... one guy attempted to burn down a hotel. He blocked the fire exits, he set fire to it. And you had people on there, under the guise of free speech, inciting this stuff. Now, I think incitement to serious violence and murder is something I'm comfortable with people being punished for. I don't think that is just opinion or causing offence. I think you are deliberately targeting some of the weakest people in society who have very few voices, often in the public realm. That, for me, crosses the boundary of free speech into incitement to violence.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad we're getting into the heart of it now, because Jonathan, I know you'll have a response.
Well, we certainly have a widening gap here, and I want to address that. First of all, there's a lot of complaints about Twitter and the rise of conservative speech. There was certainly a change with regard to Twitter's censorship system. He got rid of about 99% of it. In physical form and in other forms. The question about whether algorithms are being manipulated is different. I'm perfectly willing to criticize, if that's true, the manipulation of algorithms. But most of the complaint with regard to Twitter is that there are groups on Twitter that wouldn't have been allowed, and views that wouldn't have been allowed before from us. For some of us who are dinosaurs in the free speech community, where the objection is to free speech. You're making an objection to free speech. Yeah, those may be popular voices. You might find them offensive. The solution is to speak against them. The solution is to show where they're wrong. And the example of the riots recently in England is a good example, is particularly poignant, because I wrote a column after those riots, because in my book I talk about rage rhetoric, and rage is an odd thing. It allows you to do and say things that you would not ordinarily do or say. It's a license. It's addictive and it's contagious, and we live in an age of rage. That is very clear. But the problem is not the rage. We've had rage rhetoric in the United States since the founding. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It became conduct. But there's always been rage rhetoric. The real danger is when rage rhetoric becomes state rage. It's when governments use rage rhetoric to silence citizens. That's what happened in the UK. After those riots, yes, on social media, there was a lot of false statements that fueled that. That is a price to pay with free speech. But what did the government do? It immediately moved to put forward legislation that would have criminalized xenophobia, would have further expanded the criminalization in England. Now, ultimately, and also Ireland put forward a particularly horrible and draconian version of that I'm happy to say recently failed. And I'll note that it failed surprisingly enough because the Irish youth moved against it in Ireland, which surprised the government. But the real danger, I think, is not that riot. Riots will occur. False things will be said. It's our duty for us all to speak up, to fight the falsehood, to have good speech overcome bad speech. But you can't have it halfway. You can't say, I'm in favor of free speech, but not that stuff that I find really upsetting, or not that stuff that leads people to do things. Incitement is just another term for what used to be called bad tendency speech. It is the siren's call of censorship. It's where the government say, I'm not going to let you say that because it has a bad tendency. It'll incite people to do things. And you end up with figures like Hillary Clinton, who spoke here, who is one of the great anti-free speech figures in the United States. And when Musk took over Twitter, what was the first thing she did? She called on the European Union to use the Digital Services Act to censor American citizens because the censorship system was being dismantled. you can't go down that road. You have to make a decision.
I want to, I agree with what Jonathan says, but I also agree with an important point that you made, Matt, which is that some of this is illegal and appropriately illegal, even under the strict First Amendment standards. Incitement used loosely as, that might lead somebody to engage in violence, that adds up to bad tendency. But intentional incitement of imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently, it's an appropriately tough standard, but if it is met, the speech may and should be punished. Now, with respect to algorithms, I just want to say there's a lot of common sense out there and consensus that algorithms are driving people into rabbit holes and echo chambers. And there's actually some serious studies that are now being done at Oxford and Harvard and universities all over the world. And it turns out that we have a lot of echo chambers about echo chambers, and that the scientific studies are very intriguing, that they're showing that the algorithms are actually having a moderating impact on what people are looking for, that left to their own devices, people would become even more extreme. So I think that those of us who say we're against disinformation, we're for the search for truth, should hold ourselves to that standard and use the tools that the internet itself makes available to study in a serious way the actual impact of what we just assume is bad and dangerous.
Right. Should there be, though, following up, you acknowledge some criticism potentially of algorithms being used in a way that is manipulating. And there was, I think, in other rooms in this very building, were other panels happening, all with regulators in the room, as we know, talking about the need for transparency with algorithms, even if run by a private party. And so is that an area where you would accept any regulation, or can that, because certainly I'm no legal expert, but we can acknowledge that the Founding Fathers did not consider the manipulation of algorithms when writing the Bill of Rights. And so can good speech, as you've written about, Nadine, countering hate speech, can that work against an algorithm that's opaque and manipulated? Is that fundamentally a solution?
And I think we're reaching a meeting of the minds, as I said earlier, legislation that is not outlawing speech based on dislike of its viewpoint, but that is viewpoint neutral and protecting. Think of it as consumer protection, that we have a right to make. Freedom of speech involves a right to make our own choice and informed choice about what we see and what we don't see. And we can't do that if we are not being given information about what information is being driven at us. We have to have the autonomy to make an informed choice.
And we don't know how the information is affecting us either, to your point about studying it.
And this is something that, going back more than 10 years ago, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, and digital rights organizations issued a document called the Santa Clara Principles, basic transparency and due process and privacy. And unfortunately, those have not yet been adopted in the United States or most other countries.
Thanks. Did you want to add anything about algorithms to that question?
Well, I'm all in favor of transparency. I don't like algorithms that put a thumb on the scale for viewers. Elizabeth Warren in the Senate a couple years ago, called on companies to use algorithms to steer people away from what she considered to be bad tendency books. And unfortunately, that has become a standard approach on the left in Europe and in the United States, this effort to try to restrict or direct what people are seeing. And I much prefer, I've been on Twitter since near its creation, I much prefer Twitter today than something like Blue Sky. Blue Sky was created as sort of a safe space for liberals, where you won't see all of those really pesky, horrible conservatives and all of that. And in my view, well, good luck with that. You've created your own echo chamber, and that's fine. But the rest of the world is going to continue, and the rest of the world is messy. The rest of the world has extremists on both sides. The rest of the world has false things and true things. But the one thing I'm certain of looking at history is that true things tend to prevail if you have free speech. That is, bad speech is not eliminated. You're never going to eliminate racism. You're never going to eliminate sexism, anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, that's a horrible latent gene within us. But we can overwhelm those views. And Germany is a good example of that. Censorship has done nothing for Germany except chill speech of ordinary citizens. In many ways, free speech is a leap of faith. You have to be willing to take it. And that's the reason I'm against the algorithms manipulating it. I think probably on this stage, I'm probably the least comfortable with limits on free speech. And I will note one other thing, that Nadine was talking about the standard of an imminent violence. That's the Brandenburg standard. I just want to emphasize that what was described in England would not satisfy the Brandenburg standard. That what England is doing wouldn't even come close to satisfying that standard. To saying, look, you were saying false things here, and that incited people, that would collapse as an argument.
I want to give some examples here, because I defend freedom of speech as a principle, and I know it is a principle that not only supports everybody, regardless of what your ideas are, but historically and logically, it disproportionately protects the views of those who are members of minority groups, political minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities, you name it, those who by definition lack majoritarian political power are the ones who particularly depend on it. So I want to give you some examples, because we tend to think of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and, right-wing provocateurs, and I totally defend their freedom of speech. But at the same time, one of the major cases that the ACLU had in the Supreme Court within the past couple of years was on behalf of DeRay McKesson, a major leader of the Black Lives Matter movement, who was it was not a criminal case, but it was a civil case that would have completely bankrupted the entire Black Lives Matter movement. He was charged with intentional incitement of imminent violence for speaking to a Black Lives Matter rally that was protesting police violence. There had been an unjustified killing of an unarmed young black man, and people were very angry, and they were demonstrating, and DeRay McKesson was using very intemperate language that some people felt was stirring up violence against police officers. Somebody in the crowd threw a brick, and it injured a police officer. Obviously, the person who throws the brick is culpable, but this very serious lawsuit was brought seeking punitive damages against the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Same tactics were used, by the way, against the civil rights movement in the 60s. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, because the two lower courts held that that did constitute intentional incitement of imminent violence. And I ask people to keep that example in your mind. If you think, oh, this is only going to punish people whose views I disagree with. No, it won't. It is going to punish everybody, including people whose views are very important to you.
Thank you. That's great. Do you want to say anything more about the algorithms and the topic that we were on before?
Well, if we believe that, you just counter, and I agree with the principle that you basically counter other people's opinions with yours. You can't do that on X anymore, because it's disproportionately in favour of people who spread misinformation, far-right propaganda, pro-Russian, whatever it is, that actually the moderates on there, their posts don't work in the same way, so you can't counter it because the thumb is on the scale. So if Elon Musk was truly egalitarian in the way that he ran it, I absolutely agree. That platform is not a balanced platform at all. He is not a champion of free speech.
Thank you. I do want to take some time to talk about comedy because
Yes.
hopefully it'll be more fun. And it's also a big thematic part of the opening video and political correctness, which is...
I've decided to come out against comedy.
That's great.
No, I'm sorry. No.
Good. I knew we'd have a healthy debate. But let's talk a little bit about cancel culture. In some ways, I think you're playing the role in this panel of advocating for the most kind of protective mechanisms. Yet comedy has been the subject of much of the censorious cancel culture that we talked about in the opening video showed. So what is your perspective on when comedy should be, if ever, reined in, on comics being canceled? We talked about a couple examples of that, and just your perspective on all this from a comic lens.
I think if people are joking, you've basically got to let them say anything. And I think the danger is that being offended has become currency. And people don't just go to shows and think, oh, that crossed a line, I think I'm upset. People go with the intention of being offended. People watch clips on social media taken out of context with the express intention of thinking, not only am I going to be offended by this, I'm going to try and get this person fired, get their wife to leave them, get them evicted. You know, the desire, and it's partly because of what's happened to our politics, is people truly believe that they are doing the right thing for the cause. And they think, I'm justified. This person is a bad person. They must be closed down. And it leads you to a position where none of us can joke about anything. Everything you say is deliberately taken out of context. That is not good for anyone, not just comedians. And it's not just comedians who are victims of cancel culture, or even people with platforms. It's people who work in offices. It's teachers. It's trade unionists. It can be anyone who... We have to be able to joke. We have to be able to say, well, the great things about being a human being is often saying the most inappropriate thing deliberately to pop tension. Like, it's a coping mechanism. And people who've often been through the most terrible experiences you can imagine in life will have really dark senses of humour because it is the way that you survive. And I find there's a real hypocrisy in, we will all behind closed doors say awful things. I guarantee, I do not believe anyone who says, I never say anything offensive. Because I guarantee with your friends you will say it. And yet, those same people will wish to police other people when they do it in public. Right. And I think that's one of the saddest things that's happened. I do actually think the tide has turned. I think now there was a period where I think people sort of, neutral people would think, oh my God, was that offensive? I don't want to be a bad person by not being offended by that. I think now that it's been around a few years, most people say, just grow up. Right. That person was clearly joking. They're saying it because it's inappropriate. And just saying something doesn't mean you believe it either. Right. And I think we've become far more advanced in the way that we analyse these things. Before, people would say, well, why would you say something homophobic if you're not homophobic? You think, well, because it's obviously the silliest thing to say in that context. Yeah. And therefore, as a joke, you kind of have to allow it. So I still worry about cancel culture. It's absolutely real. Right. And you see, my other fear actually with it isn't just the mob and people who actually believe they're doing the right thing. It's how weak our institutions are, of any sort. Government, regulators, publishers, film studios, comedy clubs, you name it. When the mob comes for them, their first instinct is to say, okay, maybe that person was wrong, we're very sorry, we don't lose your custom. Rather than their first instinct saying, we don't pander, basically, we don't negotiate with terrorists. You can be annoyed, but our first instinct is to actually say, we don't have a problem with this. We may investigate certain things and then come to a conclusion, but I still feel that institutions' first instinct is to say that person's been suspended, and initially just to sort of get that problem off their socials.
And potentially, of course, Donald Trump is the backlash of this to some degree, because that idea of just the locker room talk, the way people really talk, that everybody is yearning to do, is what they see in him, right? That's at least the argument that's made. So do you see his rise, his unique brand of comedy, if you can call it that, to be part of this shift in culture?
He is definitely a funny person, and I think all of us who disagree with him have to accept. I think in any political sphere, you have to accept who your opponent is. You have to accept, their strengths and their weaknesses. And being po-faced about Trump, it doesn't help. He is funny. We're not just laughing at him; we are laughing with him. He has comedic ways, by the way. I want to say what's happening today is pathetic. I think it's so sad what you're doing, and I think it's great to be here in Munich. It's my favorite part of France. It's a great history they've got here. And many great people, they do great things, but many bad people too. It's that meandering way. What I find most funny about Trump is when he's either trying to be nice or trying to be generous, but he doesn't have the detail to do. You know, I always thought Tony Blair was a great statesman in saying, you know, and it's great to be here in Berlin today. And you think back, by the way, to the existence of the Berlin Wall, and look at it now, a shrine of, frankly, you know, democracy, you know, and diplomacy. And that's why it's right that this forum happens here, and it's right that people from all over the world come here.
All right, now do Trudeau.
I don't have the face paint. Trumpets, you know, it's great to be here. There are many great people. They do very great things, and I know that in Berlin there were good people, many of them. Some of them were bad, and we don't want to think about them today. They get bad people everywhere.
Were they very fine people as well?
Very fine people on both sides. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. Again, good. And it's just that sort of meandering. He's trying to be nice. I think that's what some of his opponents don't appreciate. Is actually this guy is often behaving in what he thinks is a nice way. But he is funny, it's a big part of his appeal, and in trying to defeat him, you don't just say, oh, this guy's an idiot, or he's not funny. You kind of have to accept that it's funny, but you have to say, maybe in a president, you also need something else.
Well, I think part of the problem, isn't it, is that the people who are regulating comedy, we've seen all these arrests of comedians, are the least funny people on earth. That is, these are people who have no humor whatsoever. It's like having vegans rate meat, right? It's like, it's they have no inkling what a joke is. I tell my law students on the first day of law school when they come in, I said, look, the most important thing you could retain in law school is a sense of humor. And I must tell you, for some of you, that ship has sailed. But you just have to laugh when other people laugh. And you can pretend you have a sense of humor. But a lot of these cases I see, it's clear these people have no sense of humor. And they're just living on rage. You know? Yeah.
But it's true of a lot of Project Trump as well. J.D. Vance isn't funny. And Donald Trump Jr. isn't funny. Like, Trump has a magic medicine that is all the populist stuff plus the entertainment kind of... There's a sweetness to him. There's a vulnerability to him. And you can see that sort of, you know, it's visible. And in a way that makes him a very charming person in the way that his very serious acolytes don't possess that.
You know, I think in addition to a pervasive lack of sense of humor, or too pervasive, it's part of a larger problem, which is taking things too literally, including, so no sense of satire, no sense of irony, and in fact, taking a lot of what Trump says too literally. I think a lot of it is just rhetorical excess. But, you know, when you were talking, Matt, about and Jonathan, about the lack of courage on the part of cultural institutions that should stand up, including comedy clubs, I was thinking about 1989 and the Satanic Verses and the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And basically, the publishing industry stood up, bookstore owners largely stood up, even though they were getting serious threats against their employees and their customers. I don't think that would happen today. I think you're accused of, you know, insulting Islam, and people are offended. And let's not forget, people were killed in other countries. That I don't think we would see that kind of. I even wonder whether the book would be published today. And Rushdie himself has wondered that.
I worked on a satirical show in Britain called Spitting Image, which was huge in the 80s, satirical puppet show where the puppets are caricatures of global figures, celebrities, sports people, and then voiced by impressionists like myself. And we rebooted it a few years ago. We had a Greta Thunberg puppet. And the fact that puppet even existed drove some people mad. They said, this is an autistic girl, you can't mock her. And you think, well, you haven't seen any of the sketches we've done with her. She was the hero of every sketch she was in. You know, she was obviously going to be the kind of conscience of the piece. But the fact that we were even going to impersonate Greta Thunberg really incensed people. And it's been a real lesson that when I was growing up in the 1980s and 90s, it was seen as the sort of right were getting attacked and that they were sort of anti-comedy in a way. Now, I mean, I gig all around the UK. For many years, my experience has been that the sort of moderate centre-right are the people that can laugh at themselves the most. I remember doing an event for some Conservative donors. And I did all my sort of Labour Party impressions thinking that that's what they wanted. It didn't really get much. I then started doing Boris Johnson, saying, it's great to be here, and yes, we're going to get Brexit done. And they started banging the table and going, yes, get the bastard, get the bastard. What they wanted was their own side to be mocked. Right. Whereas, you perform in certain parts of the Edinburgh Festival, and for a while when we had Jeremy Corbyn, a very left-wing leader of the Labour Party, people would walk out when I would even get to that point. If I said, I'm Jeremy Corbyn, people would say, you cannot mimic this guy. You can't. I'm too upset that you're even teasing him. Mm-hmm. So it's been quite an interesting trajectory that, in my experience, over the last 10 or 15 years, basically your mainstream Tories will laugh at anything. The other caucuses are slightly more sensitive about their own figures and their own people.
Well, Jonathan had a column today. I'm going to be your publicist for you about 2 dinners that usually have involved good humor, where comedians are. Why don't you tell the rest of the story?
Yeah, the media in the United States has 2 big dinners. One's the Gridiron dinner, and the other one is the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And they're both designed to sort of create bridges to sitting presidents who often the media is at arm's length, if not worse, in terms of the relationship. But these are evenings in which both sides can make respectful fun of each other, and the whole idea is that you really should come so that we can have a moment where we set aside a lot of the tensions.
With humor as a bonding force.
Yeah, with a bonding force. And the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the new head of the association picked a very anti-Trump comedian who immediately said that nobody wanted Trump to show up and no one wants him to be in the same room. And it's like, wow, because you're an institution. The media is an institution designed to try to have a dialogue, and you basically just selected someone to say stay home. And then at the Gridiron, in its entire history, which is the oldest dinner of journalists in Washington, they pointedly this year said they would not toast the sitting president. And that was always the way of the media to show we respect the office. That is, we will toast the sitting president, and particularly toast him for either his being there or surrogates being there. And this year they said we won't do that. And what I wrote in the column was, I've criticized Donald Trump for his attacks on the media. I've written about a lot of columns criticizing him over that. I disagree with some of his moves, like the one with the Associated Press recently. But he's a politician. The press is an institution. And these dinners are an example that we're sawing on the branch we're sitting on. And, media outlets are collapsing in the United States. They're losing money, they're losing viewers. And you know where they're going? They're going to new media. That's where they're all going. New media is soaring. And I spoke to a media group not that long ago, and I said, look, I've worked for CBS, NBC, BBC. I've worked for 4 different networks. And I said, many of the people I worked with are in this room. And we've become a ship of fools. That is, we are replicating the same thing that is driving readers and viewers away. And we don't even have even a scintilla of curiosity as to who these people are or why they're leaving. And I'm afraid that we're not going to do that, and new media will become the media.
And the danger of that, is if you basically disrespect the office, you're disrespecting the public. Mm-hmm. And that has wide-ranging implications. You have to respect the office of the president, I totally agree. And to bring it back to the point about comedy is, what Trump understands, one, he is a funny person, so he's the ideal messenger for this, is that there is a sense that you can't say stuff anymore, or that you're not allowed to joke about certain things. He embodies that in such a potent way. And it doesn't mean that anyone who wants to defeat him or oppose him has to be funny, because you shouldn't do things that don't come naturally to you as a politician. But you have to understand that there is a general sense, and it's as potent in the United Kingdom as in the United States, that actually the liberal left have become quite censorious, quite po-faced. They've lost a sense of humour, and that is kryptonite to those movements. Is that people do have to lighten up a bit. Not try and pretend to be Trump, because that being inauthentic is a crime for a politician. But understand that there is an anxiety that he seems to be the cure for.
I think we're running low on time, and so I want to ask one question that I'm a bit personally biased about as a New Yorker living not too far from Columbia University, but also because it ties together many cases that we're talking about the role of institutions, about whether the left can also be attacked in the ways that we're describing in the examples you gave. And that is the story of Mahmoud Khalil. It's also relevant because there are protesters outside this building right now holding signs about him. So it's an international issue in which a pro-Palestinian organizer at Columbia has been arrested. I frankly think this is important to engage in because for me personally, this is a more extreme cancellation than being sort of held back from a speaking engagement at a college campus or a comedy show, if you guys see it that way. So I'd love it. I think you, Nadine, are familiar with the case, so I'd love for you to just tell folks what's happened, and then from all the perspectives we've been sharing today, how it does or does not fit into the free speech framework we're talking about.
And so I do take cancel culture and peer pressure very seriously because they clearly have had an impact in punishing people for speaking and deterring others from speaking. But I think if you have to choose which is the greater threat, civil society or government, which has a monopoly on coercive power and even investigative power and can ruin your life in a way that even the most powerful private sector forces can't. There's real cause for concern. So this is a recent graduate student who got his master's degree from Columbia, who was arrested at his home. This is all, I've read it in the press. I haven't been able to do my own original research, so that disclaimer. But press accounts say that he was arrested and taken his green card, which makes him a legal permanent resident of the United States, was supposedly taken from him, and he was taken to an immigration detention facility in Louisiana, denied access to any communication with his lawyers for a few days, and is facing deportation under some statutes that give very broad, vague discretion to the Secretary of State to basically say that somebody is posing some kind of threat to national security and can be deported on that basis. So this is a situation where the executive does have statutory authority. That's a problem that existed under some of the other executive branch actions. But there is a serious argument that that statutory authority and the implementation of it violates the First Amendment. So let me say that the law is unclear about the extent of the government's deportation power over non-citizens. Ironically, it is completely clear, going back to old Supreme Court cases from the 1940s, that a non-citizen, regardless of the non-citizen status, may not be subject to criminal prosecution or civil penalties for exercising what would be protected free speech on the part of American citizens. And the government hasn't made any allegations other than that he has engaged in and led protest activities that would be completely protected under the First Amendment. Maybe there's some evidence that they have not yet brought to light. However, there's an old case from the Cold War McCarthy era in which the Supreme Court said that the government has essentially plenary power when it comes to deportation. So even though he couldn't be criminally prosecuted based on what is now being publicly alleged against him, he might be subject to deportation.
It does feel very McCarthy-esque to me in general, and I'm curious, Jonathan, if you have a different take before we open it up for questions.
Well,
The
Khalil case is first of all, for him, there's a great challenge here because under the federal law, Secretary Rubio just simply needs to show a reasonable belief, effectively, that this could potentially cause a serious threat to national security. So the courts have been fairly deferential. But Khalil is a permanent resident, and he is entitled to constitutional rights. When you're in the United States, constitutional rights do adhere to you, particularly if you are a green card holder. You don't have the full range of rights necessarily as a citizen, but when it comes to free speech, you are entitled to, and many of us have raised concerns. He had every right to protest for Palestine, and this does create those free speech concerns. Now, what the administration is saying is that they believe that he had direct contacts with Hamas, which is defined as a terrorist group in the United States, but more importantly, that he was directly involved in the occupation and ultimately the property damage that occurred at Columbia. And one of the things that I've said in my book is that we have to focus when you look at free speech on whether it's the content of speech or conduct that is being used as the basis for the action. The administration is suggesting that it's conduct, that they believe that he was directly involved in the trespass. You don't need a crime to do this. I have not seen evidence of that. And part of the concern I have in the immigration process is that they might not have to show evidence. And so that is a major concern for free speech. Now, whether they will ultimately show that in Louisiana, we will see. But so far, we have not seen that type of evidence.
Yeah. Well, I want to take this time to open it up, and if we have time, we'll make any last comments. I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, well, speaking as a Columbia professor, he almost certainly did engage in conduct, violating time, place, and manner type restrictions on campus, occupation of building, occupation of a part of campus that was declared as Zionist-free territory, meaning that Jewish students could not enter it. So it was more than having an opinion. And I'm saying this as somebody who was kind of co-chairing the Academic Freedom Council at Columbia. So I'm kind of very mindful of the expression part of it, but I think that he crossed it, but it is true they did not actually show the evidence. Now, just one brief point to you. You said that Elon Musk is controlling all these, on X, all these opinions. The numbers that I have here, this is from Pew Research Center, political alignment of news influences, self-identified, of all influences, not just on X. 27% are right-leaning, 48% left-leaning. Okay, now in Twitter, Twitter has a slight majority of conservative over liberal, left-leaning. True, but I don't think that kind of I mean, part of it is self-selected. Excuse me. The left ones go to blue sky and stuff like that, so it's not that they're being precluded here, which I think we're kind of.
It's about what he shows you. So there may be more left-wing users on Twitter, but it's what you actually see. It's what you're shown.
Not users, influencers.
Yes, but if the minority of influencers are being shown to the majority of users, that's the point. It's about who Elon Musk shows you. It's not about how many of you there are. It's that I'm a left-wing user. I go on there. All I see is far-right stuff.
Do you have any evidence?
Well, my eyes have shown me that. I mean, that's statistical evidence to show you.
We'll move on to the next question. We got in the back.
Jonathan, I think this is probably a question for you. When you look around the world at governments, which one gets closest to treating this as the indispensable right that you're sort of advocating for? I'd just be really curious to hear that. And then I'm going to squeeze in a second as well for whoever wants to take it, which is about tactics. So let's say that Twitter is a cesspool, and there's all kinds of problematic things about its algorithm. If you wanted to do something about that as a citizen, what would you suggest in terms of tactics?
Well, those are great questions. It's funny, when I came here and I saw the title of this was A New World Order based on European values from the free speech community, that was a pretty chilling message because the last thing I would want to import from Europe are free speech values that it currently hold in Europe. I don't have a country that I can point to. The United States has always been the gold standard for free speech because of the First Amendment. But as my book talks about, we're not as good as our advertising. We go through these ages of rage, and we release what Madison called the monster, which is speech regulations, and it lives within us, and we release it on our neighbors when we're really afraid or really angry. And then the pendulum swings back. But pound for pound, the United States is still the best country in my view when it comes to free speech. I think that it is improving. I think that there is a shift that we have seen where the public is also moving against censorship, against these speech regulations. So I would point to that, but perhaps you want to talk about the second question.
Well, I think setting up something like Blue Sky is the answer. Well, I think it's two things. One, you set up alternative spaces that operate under different rules. Secondly, you don't necessarily leave X. I think one of the great things that Trump understood was the phrase flood the zone, I think, is a really powerful sort of tactic for how you sort of counter someone that's doing that, is that you get more of you on there and you organise through hashtags or however you figure out the algorithm. But you also, I do think, have to set up your own space. You stay on X and you continue to provide moderate voices on there, but also setting up a rival is also a form of power, because that, a sort of rival for advertising money and things like that, it's also a marketplace. And if you threaten anything, legacy media, new media, with a more attractive proposition for advertisers, that in itself is a form of nudge on an owner like Elon Musk or whoever takes it over from him.
We'll do one or two more questions in the back.
Yeah, so have you guys ever seen a situation, we're talking about free speech, a situation like this where the biggest threat to freedom of speech is a different country? So Israel is threatening everybody's freedom of speech all across the world. I can get arrested here in Germany if I say the wrong thing about Israel. Apparently I can now get arrested and maybe even deported, although now I'm a citizen so I can't, you think, if you criticize Israel. So this is madness. Like, I can criticize America all day long in America, I can criticize Germany all day long in Germany, but now half the countries, if you criticize Israel, you'll be arrested or deported. So isn't the biggest threat to freedom of speech in the whole world Israel?
No. I would absolutely say no to that, because there are so many countries that have repressive speech policies that they are exporting around the world. Well, the first one that occurs to me, speaking as you sound like an American, another American, is China, which through the terror it imposes on and the control it imposes on international students that it's sending to campuses all over the United States and faculty members who are engaging in surveillance of other Chinese students and having an enormous chilling impact on campuses all across the U.S. and beyond. I happen to know this because I just read a forthcoming book about it. So there are a lot of countries that are much more, who are authoritarian, right? Who are, well,
and
let's
monitoring every student,
okay.
in every campus.
Let's just, okay. You're entitled to your opinion, but I'm saying that there, in every country, as my friend Floyd Abrams once said, that's a very strong opinion. There are so many countries that have repressive free speech policies that are having an influence all around the world, including the United States, including through things like the Digital Services Act in Europe and other controls on social media that I think are just pervasive problems.
I'm getting the text to wrap up, but you've had your hand up for a long time, so I think this will be the last one. We'll do two more, if you can make it quick.
Sorry, the problem with seeing Elon Musk as the free speech warrior, even in the US, is that it completely sees US in a silo, and it ignores Elon Musk's actions or Mark Zuckerberg's actions across the global south. In India, for example, the government asked Twitter, when it was Twitter, to remove content, and Twitter successfully stood against them and even went to the Indian Supreme Court to stop the censorship on behalf of the government. But once Elon Musk bought it, Twitter has been extremely helpful to the Indian government to censor free speech in India. The same with Myanmar and Mark Zuckerberg, or if you see Bangladesh and with X, Twitter, whatever it is, or Meta. So you can't call Elon Musk a free speech warrior or someone who helps free speech when he conveniently sees free speech only in the US and ignores free speech wherever else. Especially, these are democratic countries. We're not even talking about oppressive regimes where it's autocratic and not, there are repressive free speech laws in place. These are countries like India, Bangladesh, who are democracies, who have elected democratic leaders for their entire history. So how can you say that Elon Musk supports freedom of speech when he conveniently ignores it in other countries?
No, it's a wonderful question, and I get it entirely. I've actually written columns opposing what's happening in India. I also opposed what happened with the social media companies in yielding to India. From Musk's perspective, I'm not an apologist for Musk. I don't correspond with him much at all. Although I wouldn't mind a new Tesla, but it's not going to happen. So. But I have to say that under Musk's time, they did push back on countries, and they were basically beaten back. And the Digital Services Act is a good example of that. I actually consider the Digital Services Act probably the greatest threat to free speech right now, overall. It is the effort of the EU to effectively regulate speech in every other country, including the United States. The EU has not been exactly subtle in that. They've said that they will use the DSA to force censorship. The reason some of us in the free speech community are thankful to Musk is he changed the debate. The Twitter files is what we needed, and we were losing. And I can tell you, as someone who has testified over 100 times in Congress, we were losing. And when the Twitter files came out, it changed everything. He gave us what we needed to show that there was this concerted effort of censorship. Does that mean he's perfect? No. In the free speech community, we don't focus on perfect, and we never make any assumptions about our allies. I haven't liked a president since James Madison, and I am not someone who is. I've written critical pieces of Trump in the first free speech. We are always burdened by bad allies in the free speech community. But we also have to recognize when people have done great things for free speech. Buying Twitter, in my view, was one of the most significant factors for the free speech movement worldwide. And Zuckerberg could not just, where Musk held the line, Zuckerberg could turn around the anti-free speech movement if he truly means what he says. And it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be hypocrisy. And I agree with you about what's happening in those countries. But we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because that's all we ever get in the free speech movement. We're lucky to get good.
Thanks, Jonathan. Do we have time for one more? The one in the back. Sorry, you better ask one.
Yes, hello. Very, very interesting conversation. I am a climate activist, and what happened to many of us in the climate space since Musk took over Twitter is that because of apparently now free speech is understood as you can say anything, however harmful it is and however threatening it is, people like me who are working in the public are not only being threatened on spaces like X. It's 100 people debating on X, like, so where is this woman living? And the 101st person is kind of taking a look, where is she going? And that meant for me that I have to take personal security to protests that I organize, democratic peaceful protests. And so I think it's very interesting to talk about free speech as a phenomenon that is having to do with rhetoric only. It can get very physical, and what we're seeing is at the moment that under the idea of apparent free speech or deregulation, you open up the floodgates to any amount of hatred, of threats, of discrimination, of whatever is piling up there, which is fueling, people to a point that it's getting very physical. I'm not sure we can talk about that movement as something that has to do with liberation, that is very oppressive in consequences that aren't just coincidental, but that are very linear to that very regulation or deregulation.
That was one of the, thank you for raising that topic. It was one on the long list that we had of how do you protect against targeted harassment, which is or expression that constitutes a true threat because you reasonably fear for your safety. which is not good for free speech because it intimidates you from exercising your free speech rights. And even the speech protective American law recognizes that that kind of expression is not protected. I would say the best, and studies have been done that unfortunately show that disproportionately women are being driven off certain social media platforms because of fear that they're going to be subject to this kind of unprotected expression. The best resources that I know of were put out by an organization called PEN. It's a writers and free speech organization. And they've done a number, and they're very strongly protective of free speech. And, I'm not going to say but, and that means protecting freedom for everybody to freely communicate without fear that they're going to be subject to violence or threats. And they've put out great resources, handbooks that give guidance to journalists, to the organizations that impose journalists, online resources, and other resources to help protect you, meaningfully exercise your free speech rights.
I want to thank Nadine, Jonathan, Matt for a very timely, urgent, and occasionally funny discussion. We will.
He was talking about me.
Jonathan, the funny part. Maybe we'll stick around in the hallway because a couple people had questions, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you all. Thank you to the World Forum for having us, and keep free speech alive.